Det var jo de årene da en hadde nok så sterke indre brytninger. Indre brytninger.
Hei og velkommen til Noen har snakket sammen. Mitt navn Tiril Rustan Halvorsen.
Og jeg heter Aksel Fjellavli.
Nok en international guest i dag.
Ja, det stemmer det.
Ja.
Og i denne episoden her så skal vi snakke om næringspolitikk, eller industrial policy, som vi kommer til å omtale som på engelsk. Litt mer nærmere bestemt den tenkningen rundt det som har blitt kjent som Green New Deal i USA.
Og Green New Deal blir jo gjerne assosiert i Norge med denne Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC. Men hun har også andre i ryggen, og en av de Zack Exley, som leder av Tenketanken New Consensus. Og han i Norge i forbindelse med SV sin høstkonferanse, og har tatt turen til studiet vårt.
Yes.
Okay, Zack Exley, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Can you first tell us something about what New Consensus is?
Yeah, sure. New Consensus, it's a new think tank. We set it up a few years ago coming out of the Justice Democrats movement in the U.S.
And what are the Justice Democrats?
Yeah, so Justice Democrats was a project that I started with some other people coming out of the Bernie campaign. And originally we called it Brand New Congress. And the idea was to elect a brand new Congress. And we were going to recruit hundreds of candidates. It was a wacky idea. We knew it was wacky. In the end, we recruited 15. Only one won. Only one of them won their election. That was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And there's a great movie about it if you want to watch the movie on Netflix. It's called Knock Down the House or Knocking Down the House. Knock Down the House. So one thing that I experienced during that whole project was, we were trying to run all of these candidates as a block. And I made it sound like a total failure with only one candidate, but AOC, as we call Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the U.S., she made a huge difference. But then Justice Democrats went on to elect another dozen or so candidates over the next two elections. So now there's a little block in Congress, and they're really having a big impact. But my experience at the beginning of that project was, we were trying to run these candidates as a block with a shared economic vision for the country. But I was not an economist, and neither was anybody I was working with on the campaign. And every now and then our candidates would look at us and just be like, why should we believe you guys? And they would take what we were saying, back to their brother-in-law who was a banker over Thanksgiving dinner, and he would say, no, these people you're listening to are crazy, that none of that's going to work. And so we realized that, it was hard for our candidates to really absorb this big picture economic vision of building a new clean economy and dismantling the old dirty one. It was hard for them to really absorb that, and I think trust it too. So we realized we needed some more infrastructure. We needed a think tank to develop some of these ideas. And we were really inspired by the history in the U.S. of the rise of neoliberalism, and we had been studying and reading a lot of the histories of how neoliberalism became so powerful and popular in the U.S. Our favorite book is Invisible Hands by Kim Phillips Fine, a historian in the U.S. And, and one of the parts of that story is that these business people that really wanted, business to reign supreme, and wanted the society and the state to just, disappear from the economy, they founded a whole bunch of think tanks back in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. And those are incredibly powerful in the U.S. now, and they're really responsible in large part for this rise of neoliberalism in the whole world. So we said we should maybe have an institution like that for ourselves.
And that is New Consensus.
That's New Consensus.
And the policy package, which are talking about this bundle of economic ideas, which are known under the name of the Green New Deal. What was the idea behind this specific set of policies? Why a Green New Deal?
The idea is that we have this old, dirty economy that is destroying the planet. We know that. And it's also, in the United States, it's failing to provide a means of making a living, a decent means of making a living for Americans. And, wages in the U.S. have been falling for more than 40 years. I'm talking about real wages, of course, adjusted for inflation. And if you look at the bottom, 60 or 70% of U.S. income earners, their wages and their living conditions and their working conditions have really been dropping fast. And this is crazy in, literally the richest country in the world, the country in the world with by far the largest GDP, and a very high per capita GDP. So this doesn't make any sense. So we have an economy, we have this, means of making a living that is not providing for the people, and it's destroying the planet. So we need to dismantle that and build a new one. Mm-hmm. And so how do you think about that? So the Green New Deal introduces a solution to that problem. And today it's a lot easier to talk about than it was like 4 years ago when we were starting to talk about this. But because a lot of the ideas around industrial policy and reindustrialization and all that kind of stuff have been more accepted now. But but basically what we're talking about is that society needs to step up and organize massive investments into new industries. Kind of like what Norway did when you guys discovered oil, There was a huge national effort to, yes, attract foreign investment from other countries, but to bring that in on terms that were really good for developing Norway's own industries. And so now Norway has all these really valuable,
not so green jobs.
Not so green, but Norway created these incredibly valuable industries that have made Norway rich and have supplied the world with tons and tons of oil, bajillions of tons of oil, right? So, and so that was good. That was a good idea for Norway, right? To do that for Norway as a country. There's a million examples of that all around the world, of countries intentionally developing their industries that provided their people with a good means of making a living and, gave them what they needed. And this is also what's created all this growing prosperity all over the world. It's societies deciding to build industries. And if you look at basically every major, high value industry in the world, in almost every country, if you look at the history of that industry, you'll find that there were these very intentional decisions by societies, usually through governments, to organize investments, that didn't really make sense from a, free market global trade perspective. Like, it would have been cheaper for Norway to just buy all of the oil rig equipment from foreigners, right? It would have been cheaper to just let, Shell and BP and Exxon come in and build all that stuff for you. But Norway made a decision that we're going to actually profit from, this stuff. We're going to have high wage jobs for Norwegians. We're not just going to bring all these, foreigners to make this money and then send them home with that money. And that's a smart decision. And so if you look at all the rich countries in the world and you look at their most lucrative industries, you'll almost always find that history, Another really great example of this is if you look at the Japanese auto industry. Japan almost didn't have an auto industry. they invested for decades into this really terrible auto industry that made the worst cars in the world that nobody wanted. And they protected this industry in Japan. Japanese people were miserable with these terrible cars. They were like, why can't we buy those American cars and those European cars? And they first tried to export Japanese cars in, I think it was 1957. And everybody laughed at these cars. They were the worst. And Japan, was like nationally humiliated. And they had this big debate about whether they should continue on. Norway did this too with the Think, right? Mm-hmm. And Norway chickened out. Actually, no, Ford bought it and shut it down, right? So maybe Norway did not chicken out. But Japan persisted. And of course, now the best cars in the world are from Japan. So we're saying we need to do this in the U.S. And when we first suggested that, it was like crazy. Everybody was, they could not, they looked at us like we were crazy. What are you talking about?
It doesn't sound that very American to have a huge state intervention in the market economy. Do you have any history of similar experiments?
Yes, that's the thing. There's this forgotten history. And part of what we're trying to do is to resurface that, that history. And we're trying to bring that back into our national memory. But in fact, the U.S. was one of the earliest countries that invented this system. And we actually had a name for it, and we called it the American system. Have you guys ever heard of the American system?
Only the Norwegian model.
What do you mean?
We always talk about the Norwegian model that should be exported to every other country, but the American.
Oh yeah,
no.
Oh yeah. We'll take the Norwegian system now. Yeah, but no, it was way back in. I think it was Henry Clay who named the American system, and he was way back in like the late 1700s, early 1800s. It really started with Alexander Hamilton, and the first Treasury Secretary, who everybody now knows because of the Broadway musical. But he, and actually a bunch of the musical was about this, and how he had this economic, industrial policy, and he, Hamilton actually built. These industrial workshops, we call them skunk works. I don't know if they called them skunk works back then, but they, in New Jersey, because he was from New Jersey wasn't too far from New York, which was the capital then. And Hamilton built like these big workshops where the government poured tons of investment capital into developing new techniques of mass manufacturing of weapons, because we were worried that the English were going to come back and beat us up again. And so we wanted to get ahead of them. We wanted to build better weapons. And we also wanted to make money. And so because, the U.S. was in a lot of debt and having a lot of trouble then. So Hamilton had watched how the Industrial Revolution had developed in Britain, which did actually involve a lot of state investment and state direction. So that's another story. And so he wanted to copy that. And there's actually, there's a bunch of great books about this where, real mass manufacturing was invented in those workshops that Hamilton set up. They developed really incredible new technologies that went into all subsequent U.S. industry. And so there were incredible developments through the 1800s, that led right up to the Gilded Age, which allowed the U.S. very improbably to outcompete Britain. In the same way that China is outcompeting the U.S. as the workshop of the world right now. Back then, the U.S. had that same relationship with Britain, and we, expanded and overtook Britain in world markets, largely because of this state-led, industrial development. So that's one example. But then another big example is in World War II, in our economic mobilization leading up to World War II, and we really rely on this World War II example a lot at New Consensus to teach these concepts. The U.S. industrial economy was really dead leading up to World War II because we had been in the Great Depression. And but then suddenly it turned out to be the United States' role in this huge war against fascism to supply all of the steel and ships and tanks and planes and, everything else that needed to be produced. And some of this stuff had never been mass manufactured before. Like airplanes had never been mass manufactured. They were like craft, products. There were no blueprints for the parts and stuff like that. So Franklin Roosevelt did this amazing thing. He hired the president of General Motors. And so this wasn't a case of, government bureaucrats, in a command and control way dictating how the economy was going to work. Roosevelt was a lot smarter than that. And he hired the president of General Motors, which was the biggest corporation in the world at the time. Mm-hmm. And he put this guy in charge of reorganizing the economy and building up these new industries. And like if you look up the story of how the U.S. mass manufactured airplanes for the first time and made unbelievable quantities of them that nobody ever thought would be possible, it's really an incredible example of, and it's just one of many from that World War II story. It's this incredible example of society saying, we need to do something brand new on a massive scale. Let's see how we can organize that and make it happen. And it was a huge success story. And so if you want, we can go more into details about how that worked, but I don't want to just keep rambling here. But we need to do exactly that now, right? There's a whole bunch of different technologies that we need to build on a massive scale really quickly to replace the dirty technologies that are destroying the planet. And so we have a model in the U.S. for how to do that. And it's just sitting there waiting for us to pick it up again and use it.
We had Berkeley economist Brad DeLong on the podcast last week, and by the way, he has written a very nice short book on this Hamiltonian way of doing stuff. But we asked him, among other things, what comes after neoliberalism, and he said basically that he doesn't know, that we are in an era of confusion, but what he listed up as one of the things that were possible, like the next neoliberalism, was what he named supply side progressivism, which essentially is that it isn't fair distribution that is the main focus. It isn't increasing the demand in the economy that is the main focus, but the main focus is to increase the supply of essential goods, that meaning energy, housing, education, so on and so on. Do you view the New Consensus project as a supply-side progressive project, or is there some other label that is more fitting?
I think there is a different label. I'm not sure what the label should be exactly, but
we're confusion.
yeah, not confusion, no. But I think, like, I really love Brad DeLong, and I love his book Concrete Economics that you were referring to. It's on our reading list, and we got a lot out of that. But we're standing for like one step beyond what Brad DeLong and a lot of other progressives are recommending. And Brad is really interesting because, he wasn't really a progressive. He was this like very neoliberal, mainstream Clintonomics kind of guy. And so, and when he came out with that book and started, saying, hey, we actually need state leadership, that was one of the signs that there was this new consensus that was emerging. That's where we got our name from, because there was this new consensus emerging among a bunch of economists. But we are really trying to push that consensus further down the line than it is, right now, or than it's kind of going, because things have gotten so bad that what we really need is a real kind of sweeping transformation. Like, we can't just have a bunch of new policies that encourage, investment in supply chains. That would be good. That would be better. In fact, we're getting that now. This big bill that Biden just passed, which probably you talked about with Brad DeLong, I guess, right? Did that come up on the? No, really? Oh, okay.
We should have.
I would like to know what he's thought about it. Yeah. But this big bill, it's called the Inflation Reduction Act because, we our politicians just try to name their accomplishments over whatever is important in their elections and their polls. But really what it is it's this huge package of industrial policy spending. And it's a ton of money for like loan programs where startup companies and existing companies can get, big giant loans from the Department of Energy and from other agencies to build battery factories and, startups around new battery technologies and whatever, everything, there's huge tax rebates and other kinds of grants and incentives for just everything green, basically. And not just that, also things like starting to beef up our semiconductor supply chain and other supply chains that are really important. So it's this amazing accomplishment, and it's exactly what, supply side progressivism is sort of pushing for, which is let's get, market signals all pushing in the right direction for more investment here in our country where we need to build up our means of making a living. And also, so not just for our own sake, but so that we can supply the world with all this green stuff that it needs to do the whole global transition. So that's all really important. But what we're arguing is that just, lining up market signals in the right direction is just not enough for where we are. If we had retained these policies, because we used to have, after World War II, we had all the market signals were lined up in the right direction to, make sure that we could have our own, means of making a living and not, ship our entire means of making a living off to China, right? We had all of that set up. There was planning, there were institutions that could make public investments into industry and, fund research and development, all that stuff. We had that and we dismantled it. The story of why and how we dismantled it is really interesting, but don't get me started. If we had those institutions in place over these last 50, 60, 70 years, time flies. Yeah. But we then, we wouldn't need this massive sweeping transformation right now because we'd probably be in a position more like Norway, we'd probably be fairly healthy, and have a really productive economy. But we're in such sad shape that we really need kind of an economic revolution, where we are not just, having market signals to encourage things to develop in the right direction, but where we actually do what we did in World War II and where we say we need this whole new industry and we need it right away. And we need this other industry and we need it right away. And we need to do that for like 50 different industries. We just need to conjure them out of nothing. And that's going to take not just market signals, but like it's going to take an actual like national investment corporation. That's something that we're calling for the creation of that will actually make this stuff happen.
But even in Norway, there's the debate about how when the economy needs to shift and it's not enough to like give market signals. So even though I think we have some institutions and some economic groundwork in place that you don't have, it sounds similar than to the Norwegian debate. But one of the critics here has been that the government is picking winners. Mm-hmm. And that this huge governmental spending spree causes rent-seeking that you don't want to have. Mm-hmm. So how is this debate in the U.S.?
Well, let's talk about Norway for a minute though, mm-hmm. because I agree. Like I was saying we'd be in better shape like Norway if we had kept all those institutions. Because, I don't see crushing poverty in Norway, which is great. I think maybe we would be in that kind of a position. But I also see Norway as being in a really good position, to totally reinvent its economy, to get off of oil and replace that huge, like 1/4 of your economy with other really lucrative, productive stuff. I think you're in the perfect position to do that. Whereas for us, it's going to be more of a struggle. Because, we've just given away so much of our industry. I think like Norway is still I think GDP is like 20% industrial or something. And I don't know, people will argue about these numbers, but
Yeah, but we have even brought back the industry from China back to Norway.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Yeah, but I think you never gave away like as much of it as we did. Like the U.S. is down to like 7 or 8% industrial production of our GDP. And so it's, we're really hurting. I'm hoping that it could be like an advantage in the same way that, that second comer advantage, like after World War II, Europe and Japan kind of had an advantage because they could start from scratch almost, with their industries. And so they wound up building much more efficient and modern industries than the U.S. had. And so maybe the U.S. is in that position. But back to Norway, I think that it's funny when people say, we don't want to pick winners. Why would you not want to pick a winner?
Because
because it might be a loser. Yeah, because you could be picking a loser. But we really need to get over this fear of picking winners. The whole history of capitalism, and we need to get over this fear of picking losers, right? Because the whole history of capitalism is the history of picking losers. Like, if you actually look at how, if you just really look at the details of the industrial development of any rich country, any industrialized country, you see tons and tons of losers being picked. In the U.S., for example, if you look at the history of how the railroads were built out, because the U.S. was the first major country to just build tons and tons of railroads, the railroads were all built on different widths. So there were like competing lines going from one city to another city of different widths, different gauges, as we say. And then you have like multiple lines going from between the same two cities. So there was so much waste, most of the companies went out of business. It was the most wasteful, chaotic thing ever. And that is exactly what developed our steel industry and our steam engine industry and like a million other kinds of industries, because there was so much activity around building out this massive railroad system. So I'm not saying that waste is good, but, just think about your own life, everything you do isn't a winner, right? And there's just no way you get from point A to point B by like always picking the exact right thing and the exact right choice. So, and we know that, right? Nobody that argues against the state picking a winner is actually saying that like capitalism is only going to pick winners, right? Like what they're saying is that, the state should not pick losers. Let corporations, let the private market pick losers, right? There's this idea that like, for some reason it would be bad if the state tried to pick a winner, which actually turned out to be a loser. But if, what's the big state oil company called here again?
Equinor.
I'm not going to try to say that. But if the big state
Stat
oil,
formerly known as Statoil.
Oh, right. No, but wait, not the state oil company. What's the big private oil company? Isn't there one really big?
Private?
Isn't there? I thought there were a bunch of private oil companies. No?
Not.
Okay, what's the biggest private corporation in Norway?
Hydro?
But that's also partly state-owned.
Oh, man.
Norwegian state owned like 70% of the Oslo Børs, of the stock exchange.
See, this is what I don't understand. The state's been picking winners in Norway for a while. It's been working out really well. So why is everybody worried about picking winners? But no, my point is that, like let me stop trying to find Norwegian examples.
Formally state-owned.
Okay, never mind. I'm giving up on trying to find a private Norwegian corporation.
Quite embarrassing.
But let's say in the U.S., right? Like in the U.S., like we're letting in the U.S., we don't pick winners, right? Because they might become losers. So the state doesn't pick winners because God forbid the state pick a winner that turns into a loser. But think about, so we just let the markets do it all. Well, one of the winners that the markets picked recently was fracking, and we had this huge fracking revolution, and it destroyed so much of the land, it destroyed so much of the water, It introduced this whole new supply of gas. It converted our, our whole society converted from converted all this stuff from electricity to gas, going in exactly the wrong direction. This was one of the, and now it turns out that it was actually all based on fraudulent accounting, and all these fracking companies are going out of business. The basic life history of every fracking company is they get all this debt, they sell a bunch of oil, the founders make some money, and then they sell it to somebody where it then goes bankrupt, right? And then the society is left cleaning up the mess. So that's how we pick losers in the U.S. Our auto industry, has decided that the only cars they're going to make in the U.S. are these massive pickup trucks. They basically got out of the business of making cars. That was the decision that our auto industry made, when it turns out that, the most valuable company in the world is a startup in the United States that decided it was going to make cars in the United States, electric cars, no less. Mm-hmm. So it would have been really smart if, in hindsight, it would have been really brilliant if GM and Ford and Chrysler in the U.S. had decided to make electric cars. But they did not. They weren't smart enough or bold enough.
Do you think
to pick that winner?
Would have been?
They should have been. They should have been, and they were. They actually were, because guess how Tesla got started? Does everybody in Norway know about the big loan that Tesla got from the government? Is that a story that people tell here?
Probably not. I think Norwegians think that Norwegians made Tesla a huge company.
Oh yes, you probably right. I think we owe Tesla's success to Norway, definitely. But even before Norway, there was a U.S. Department of Energy loan program that gave Elon Musk, who frequently tweets against socialism and government intervention. Elon Musk begged the government for a loan and got a $500 million loan from the Department of Energy. This is way back in the very beginning. Tesla would, without any doubt, be out of business. We would not have ever heard of Tesla if they didn't get this government loan. So the government in that case picked a winner, and they picked right. And if they hadn't picked that winner, electric vehicles, we wouldn't be driving Teslas today, and maybe there'd be almost no electric vehicles in the world, because Tesla really showed that it worked and showed that it was possible. But guess what happened that same year? I forget what year it was. Was it 2006 or 7 or something? But that same year that the DOE gave Tesla a $500 million loan, it also gave this other company a $500 million loan. And that company was called Solyndra. And and everyone in America has heard of Solyndra because the Republicans talk about it all the time, because they say, don't let the government pick winners because they're going to be losers like Solyndra. Solyndra was a solar panel manufacturer. And of course, how stupid could they be to try to make solar panels in the United States? So dumb, right? Because they got the $500 million loan, but that was the last loan they got, and they wound up going out of business. So that year, the DOE picked a winner, Tesla, which is now the most valuable company in the world, changing the world, getting us to EVs, and they picked a loser, this solar panel manufacturer. But the thing is now, because we don't want to get all of our solar panels from China, now suddenly it's actually viable to make, economically viable and profitable to make solar panels in the U.S. The U.S. government should have kept giving loans to Solyndra, because today we would have a really big, very efficient solar panel industry in the U.S. if they had kept investing, if they had kept picking that winner. And I think you actually see that around the world, that in the really rich countries, if you look into their history of industrialization, you see that their states picked winners. Of course, they also picked some losers, but they really tried to make at least enough industries to provide prosperity to their people win. And like the example I gave of Japan, they kept doubling down. They kept putting money in over, like Toyota was unprofitable for 80 years, and this story is actually told really well in Ha-Joon Chang's Bad Samaritans, which is my favorite book of this Cambridge economist named Ha-Joon Chang. So check out his telling of this story. But they doubled down and made their auto industry a winner. But if you look at, there are other countries you can look at where they didn't keep trying. Like Brazil is a good example of this. Brazil had a lot of the same developmentalist policies for a while in the 20th century, but then they kind of, they had a change of government and a change of mind, and too many of their young elites came to the U.S. and studied economics at Harvard, and then went back to Brazil, and they very, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they started to say, wait a minute, what are we doing? Why are we trying to pick winners? And so they got half-hearted about it, and they didn't keep trying to make for example, their auto industry a success. So that's why some of us are not driving around in Brazilian cars, but there's no reason why, I'm picking Brazil as an example here, but there's no reason why Brazil couldn't have been exporting really awesome cars just like Japan. They just got obsessed with this idea that, wait a minute, what if we're picking a loser here?
I just wanted to follow up on the East Asian experience more broadly than just Japan, because as far as I understand, one important aspect of the success of, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, is that they were very much pushing for, let's call it the export tests of their companies, their products, that you had to succeed in the export market to have that kind of state support that you are talking about. I think even that what is his name, Park Chung-hee, the South Korean dictator, was throwing industrialists to jail if they didn't meet the export numbers. So I'm not saying that is something you should do, definitely not. But to focus on exports and support the companies that succeed in exports, give a sort of a quality mechanism for the companies and the products. And you could say sort of that we have the same in the Norwegian model with the peak union system, the frontfagsmodellen, where the wages are compressed in the export companies so that they can make things cheaper than they wouldn't in other ways. And in that way, it's more valuable to do export industries. So my question out of this is that in an American Green New Deal model, how do you get that export test, and how do you make sure that you promote exports enough so that you are not making products that are not good enough to succeed on the export market? Yeah.
Well, but first, the thing to remember though is that, to get to those quality exports, those East Asian countries, and and I think this applies to Europe earlier as well, and it applied to the U.S. earlier as well, is they weren't top quality right away. They built. It took them a while, and they kept investing and they kept trying. They in some cases, like with my Toyota example, it took many decades before Toyota was competitive internationally. So sometimes it can take a ton of investment and a lot of time to get there. But in the U.S., we don't really have that problem, actually, because we're not going to have that problem. Because, when you're talking about like South Korea developing under Park Chung-hee, and I believe the story was that when Park Chung-hee had his coup, he rounded up all the patriarchs of all the big countries. It's worth going on this tangent for a second because it's such a wild story. But he rounded up all the patriarchs of like Samsung and Hyundai, and they were these family businesses, right? And these companies back then, this was in what year was the coup? I think it was like early 60s, 62 or something. You're going to get emails saying, no, it was 63. But like Samsung was a vegetable exporter. That's the kind of thing that these companies did. They were like scrap metal companies. None of them made anything. And all these huge companies that now dominate the world economy, these Korean companies. So Park Chung-hee had his coup, and he had this coup because South Korea was falling deeper and deeper into poverty. It was a very interesting experiment. You had North Korea, which was communist, the most centrally planned communist country in the world. And you had South Korea, which was capitalist. And for a long time after the Korean War, North Korea kept getting richer and richer, and South Korea kept getting poorer and poorer. And South Korea was actually like poorer than most African countries. And there's all these comparisons between South Korea and Ghana, and with Ghana, at the time of independence being way better off and way more developed than South Korea was after the Korean War around the same time. So Park Chung-hee just was like, enough of this. And he has this coup, and he had this background where he had been part of this Japanese colonial experiment in Manchuria, where they were building like an industrial economy, in a coordinated, planned way. The Japanese military was doing this. And so he was part of that. And so he kind of knew what was possible. And so he rounded up all of the heads of all these, patriarchs of these family companies and put them in jail. And he did one-on-ones with them in their jail cells. And he said, I have a plan for you. You're going to make bicycles, then you're going to make motorcycles, then you're going to make cars. And then with another company, he was like, you're going to make toasters, and then you're going to make refrigerators, and then you're going to make everything, and they looked at him like, you're crazy. And he was like, well, I'm going to let you out of jail if you will agree to take tons of money from the state and start working towards these goals. So these guys sitting in jail, because, they had all been involved in all kinds of corrupt, terrible stuff, so he was like, there was plenty of grounds to have them be in jail, and so they were like, okay, we'll do your plan. And then he micromanaged the hell out of them for the next couple of decades. And voila, you have this incredibly rich economy. So, but it took work, and and again, if you, Ha-Joon Chang, who's Korean, who grew up in Park Chung-hee, South Korea, he tells these stories amazingly. And he talks about how Koreans had to live with these really substandard products, and they hated, they had to use all this Korean crap that was really low quality. They hated it. But that's what the country had to do because it was coming from a place of like no industry and no development. But the U.S., sorry to answer your question, the U.S. is not going to have to do that. Mm-hmm. And Norway will not have to do that because our economies are so incredibly advanced technologically. We have the know-how, we have the machinery. We can just build a new industry, and we see this we have these startups that are just inventing entire auto companies. Out of nothing.
Car wasn't that terribly good. I mean, there's something here.
But how that was like 25 years ago.
Yeah, that's
you
true.
cannot it's amazing that Norway was producing any electric vehicle, right? And like nobody in the world could produce a good electric vehicle. And I also it was a design decision to make it because these hippies that were starting that company, I assume. They were like, we don't want to drive around in a big car. We want a tiny, tiny little car, right? Okay, that was dumb. Like Elon Musk was smarter. And actually, it wasn't Elon Musk. It was those two guys. I hate giving Elon Musk credit for anything. It was those two other guys that started the company. But no, I think it's amazing that Norway was making an electric car back then. I feel sure that it was the best electric car in the world at the time.
Yeah.
So imagine, like, I actually think it would be possible for Norway to, like, if a couple of guys with a handful of millions of dollars can start an electric car company in California, like, why can't Norway start an electric car company? Think about all the things. The U.S. needs to start a wind turbine company, a solar panel company, a whole bunch of them.
But is everyone going to produce solar panels and electric cars? Because normally we talk about comparative advantages and free trade, and that enhances everyone's profits. And a couple of weeks ago, you can read in New York Times that Biden's Made in America policy angers key allies, and that the president's plans to bolster America's electric vehicle and battery production have opened a rift in the relationship in Asia and Europe. because we're talking about free trade
Yeah.
and it enhances profits and peace in the world. And one of the critics about this Buy American is that it pisses off Europe and China. And what's your response to that kind of critique?
I mean,
Are you going away from that free trade in the global world?
Well, no, not at all.
system?
Like every country doesn't need to make everything that it needs, and but the world right now needs way more wind turbines and electric vehicles and batteries than it's producing. Right? How long do you have to wait to get your Tesla in Norway?
A year? I
Yeah.
think?
That's crazy. What is this, the Soviet Union? You know what I mean? It's like you have to, people are waiting 2 years to get their Rivian electric pickup truck in the US, What in the world? And you want to know what's crazy? Look up, if you Google like the production numbers from Ford, like Henry Ford, when Ford was a startup, you see that Henry Ford in, what was it? It was like 1914 or something, right? Henry Ford was producing the same number of cars and growing just as fast, like the same actual number of cars as Tesla during its first 15 years. If you compare the first 15 years of Tesla to the first 15 years of Ford. Isn't that weird? Like, why is it that, I don't know if people were waiting a year or 2 years to get their Ford Model T. I don't think they were. I think Ford was meeting demand.
Just because we have problems today, and we have a war, and there's things that's stuck in the supply chain after the pandemic, and we don't have enough minerals. I think
But that's
that's
not it.
the delay today.
People were before the pandemic, and not because of mineral shortages. People were waiting years to get their Tesla. So I think it's a different attitude, right? Because I think Elon Musk is happy to have very high demand for Teslas, and I think for some, I think also, back in Henry Ford's day, that was towards the end of the Gilded Age. Wall Street wanted to invest massive quantities of money into manufacturing. That was their model. They were like, we get that this is profitable, and they actually had right up until the 20s. From like the 1880s to the 1920s, Wall Street, it was the one case of like a private market, like having a vision of national development that I've ever been able to find. And it wasn't really a market. It was actually J.P. Morgan. It was this guy and a handful of other people. And they would all get together in the same club in New York City, and on Wall Street. And they would talk about like, we're going to build this nation. They had a vision. And as far as I can tell, it's the only place where a bunch of bankers and industrialists like actually were willing to take big long-term risks. But it was a real aberration. But I think that that's why Henry Ford was able to invest so massively and meet demand, and achieve these numbers that, if you adjust for, his numbers were so impressive compared to Tesla's numbers because it was more than 100 years ago and much smaller country and much less advanced technology and all that stuff. But if we wanted to, we have the ability to invest in this stuff that needs to be made, right? And right now the world is waiting. Sorry I got on that tangent there, but but the world is waiting desperately for their electric vehicle. They're waiting for their wind turbine, right? And that stuff has to be made somewhere. Right now, what we're basically saying is we would like China to make all of that stuff. Like for some weird reason, all the other rich countries have decided, and I realize that we're now backing out of this decision, like as we speak. But up until like last year, we had all decided that for some reason China was going to make all that stuff, like that it was their responsibility. And that's crazy because it's first of all, China, as big as it is and as productive as it is not able to produce all of this stuff that we need in the world for the green transition fast enough, for it to not for us to not to destroy the planet, because we need to be off of fossil fuels like yesterday. And so that's one reason why it's not a good idea to have only China be responsible for producing all this stuff we need. But also, it's a really good way to make a living, and you guys are about to lose a quarter of your economy. So you need to add some really good ways of making a living. We already lost, like 30% of our economy when we deindustrialized over the last 50 years. So we need to replace that with good ways of making a living. And a really good way of making a living is to make really, really valuable stuff, which is, high technology, requires, high skilled labor, requires, a high, rate of capital, that is in the production process. Don't get me start talking about the labor theory of value or the, ratio of capital in labor and all this stuff. But, we need those industries to make a living. And so, yeah.
Just a quick question on specifics here, because we are a lot on the level of visions so far. But if you are to give some like specific policy like recommendations on a bit more detailed level, how do you get there? What should a country do? The one big policy that we're recommending that's specific is that we need a national investment, entity that doesn't only invest in these new industries that we need, but actually makes the industries, come into being the way Hamilton did with the story I was telling earlier. The way Norway did when it created all these industries around the oil industry, right? And so we need that investment institution in the U.S. again. And so the thing we're recommending is we want to call it the National Investment Corporation, and it's basically the revival of a thing that we used to have in the U.S. called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And that's something that was created right at the beginning of the Great Depression, ironically by Hoover, who's the one that's remembered as messing that all up. And it was actually the biggest corporation in the world all the way up until World War II. And it did all kinds of stuff. In the South, they didn't have electricity and it wasn't coming, and not on any terms that were good for the people or that made sense in any kind of a efficient way. And so the RFC created the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is even today, it's still there. It's this huge public utility that, supplies a huge chunk of the country with power. But I'll give you another random example. In the beginning of World War II, Japan captured all the rubber supplies, and in order to make all these tanks and jeeps and planes, the U.S. needed rubber. So the RFC convened these the big chemical companies in the U.S. and said, we need synthetic rubber, and they paid them up front. They gave them whatever they needed. They made the investments, and voila, we had a synthetic rubber industry. And within a year, it was producing more synthetic rubber than the whole world had been producing of real rubber earlier. So we need that institution again. And
this is kind of what you did with the Semiconductor Act, or what it was called?
Well, that's the thing. No, the semiconductor, the CHIPS Act, or whatever they called it, was great because it throws a lot of money at the chip companies, and hopefully the chip companies will use it to build some chip factories. But it's not going to be enough because we have this whole huge semiconductor supply chain which exists in Taiwan, and this is the reason why they're worrying about chips, right? Because
Taiwan.
because even without China invading Taiwan, China could just blockade. Like all these military things that China was doing around Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. I don't want to say anything bad about Nancy Pelosi for the next few weeks because she was just like the victim of this horrible political attack. But China was doing all these exercises to like show that they could blockade Taiwan. And so they to show that they could stop anything from getting in or out of Taiwan, including all the chips we need, not just to run our video game consoles, but to like run our aircraft carriers, and our airplanes, everything about American society depends on these relatively low tech chips that they just make all of them in Taiwan. And so that finally freaked out the American establishment. And so that's why they passed that act. But it's not going to be good enough because there's actually, there's thousands of kinds of chips that we absolutely need to have manufactured in the U.S. They threw all this money at these chip companies. The chip companies are going to use that money to build whatever kind of chips they feel like they'll make the most profit off of or whatever. Who knows how they're going to decide. But we actually need an institution that says there are 1,000 chips that we absolutely need to make some of. And we need factories to make them and then pay the companies to build those factories. And insulin, to take an entirely different kind of example, there's all these people that can't get insulin in the US because it's just not that profitable of a thing for the pharmaceuticals to make. And so we need an institution that says, hey, we're going to pay some companies to build insulin factories, and get those. And it's the kind of thing that I think that like the civil service in Norway has been doing for ages, with a whole bunch of different stuff. Not that you've been trying to make everything in the world, but I have a feeling that that a whole bunch of stuff has been taken care of in, because it's normal for a rich industrialized country to have institutions, that can like make investments and work with companies to make sure you're getting what you need. And I think a lot of that happens in the background on a certain level. And we just like don't have any of that. And we need it on a really huge level. So that's a specific policy. And it's really a core central policy of this whole thing that we're proposing. We're not calling it the Green New Deal anymore. I think we're calling it the Mission for America. And lefties will hate it because it sounds nationalistic. But that's really, we need to get America working in a direction not only for itself, but to supply the world with all the stuff it needs for a green transition. And I hope Norway will jump on board and do the same.
Well noted. Zack Exley, thank you so much for coming to our podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Vi får avslutte med et par anbefalinger.
Absolutt. Jeg tenkte det må være passende å anbefale den boka som ble nevnt i forbifarten her. Brad Long sin bok som heter Concrete Economics, som en ganske sånn lettlest kort bok om næringspolitikk, og egentlig på en måte fra Alexander Hamilton, som ble også nevnt her, og fremover da. Hvordan aktiv næringspolitikk har sett ut historisk da.
For denne musikalen kan man jo streame på en eller annen tjeneste.
Ja, den har jeg faktisk ikke sett.
Ja, veldig gøy, ja.
Historiens beste næringspolitiske musikal.
Jepp. Jeg skal også anbefale en bok, og en ting som ofte liksom blir borte når man snakker om sammenligning i Norge og USA, er jo det organiserte arbeidslivet og fagforeningens rolle, og mange har kanskje hørt om Tillitsmannen, som Einar Gerhardsen skrev, en bok for tillitsvalgte. Men den er jo skrevet for 50-60 år siden, eller noe sånt, og nå er det kommet en ny og oppdatert, moderne utgave skrevet av Jonas Bals og Helga Pedersen.
Skrevet fra grunnen av, altså, det er ikke bare...
Absolutt, altså her får du alt det du trenger for å få gjennomslag, få oppslutning og drive en organisasjon.
En liten verktøykasse, rett og slett.
Rett og slett. Den er gitt ut på Respublika, lanseres denne uka, og ja, sikkert å få kjøpt de fleste steder.
Ja, det får vi håpe.
Ja, en god og viktig bok. Yes. Takk for nå.
Takk for nå.